Hello, hi and welcome to this quick unplanned video. So I wasn't planning on reading anything until the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction was released, well the long list released tomorrow, although they've announced it this morning, cheeky. Yeah, now I'm back into this reading sphere. I can go 3 or 4 days without reading anything. I wasn't necessarily going to have time to read a whole novel, so I browsed my bookshelf. I have a selection of short stories and this one spoke to me. So it's the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And there's other stories, short stories in here and some extracts from her autobiography, I believe, but I've only read the Yellow Wallpaper. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman was an American novelist, writer, lecturer, and staunch feminist. She very much wrote about gender divisions in society, as well as the oppression of women. So she was sort of late 19th, early 20th century, so Victorian era to begin with, but in the States. So obviously we had that divide, not just here in the UK, but over there in the States as well. So the Yellow Wallpaper was published in 1892 in the New England magazine over in the States. And in the introduction by Maggie O'Farrell, it's stated that it's almost an autobiographical account of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's own experience, fictionalized obviously in places. And it's quite an interesting read. So the narrator in the story is suffering from what we would call postpartum depression after having her child, and it follows her deterioration and descent into sort of delirium, psychosis, if you like. So what I found really interesting is there's a doctor named in here, Dr. Weir Mitchell, and this is an actual real person who Charlotte Perkins Gilman saw herself when she was suffering from her mental health issues. And it's almost used as a threat against the narrator. So her husband, John, in the story is also a doctor, and he's the one that's prescribed this rest cure, which is complete isolation, no work, no getting out of bed, no speaking to anyone. And there's a part where it says, if you don't get better soon, I'll send you to Dr. Weir Mitchell. But in real life, Dr. Weir Mitchell is the Dr. Gilman Perkins Gilman saw, who prescribed this rest cure. And apparently she sent the story to him when she had completed it and didn't receive any response at all. But apparently she heard through the grapevine that he had told people since receiving the story he had changed his method slightly, which is quite interesting. So the story starts with the narrator and her husband John staying at this colonial mansion in the States for 3 months. And this is for her rest cure, for her to get better. Funnily enough, even on the first page, as I said, her husband John is a physician himself. And she makes the point of saying, maybe this is the reason why I'm not getting better faster. The fact that he's a doctor and he's the one prescribing this rest cure to me. The narrator obviously very much disagrees with the treatment she's been prescribed. She believes that, excitement and change will do her so much better than isolation and not speaking to anyone. But the point is raised, what can she do when these men in her life, so her brother is also a physician, and he's also agreeing with the husband that rest cure is the best medicine for this psychosis that she's going through. And she struggles with, what can I do when these people, these men around me who have authority over me almost, are telling me this is what I have to do, what can I do? So then we get on to the point of the wallpaper, which is a really fascinating subject to concentrate on for someone suffering from psychosis. It starts with her saying she'd never seen such a worse wallpaper in all her life. And it constantly irritates her just to look at it. The patterns, they don't make sense. The colour is repellent. Almost revolting, a smouldering, unclean yellow. It's dramatic and blunt language that she uses here to describe this wallpaper. The story is written in the guise of a journal, so it's various journal entries, and it's quite interesting how she has to do it in secret because she's been told she's not allowed to do any writing, any work, not even get out of bed. So when she's writing the page, and she'll suddenly be like, oh, John's coming, and then it stops, and then you pick up again at the next part. One of the first signs of the mental distress that the narrator's going through is the wallpaper, and she tells her husband she either wants to redecorate the room or move to another room, because they're in a colonial mansion. There's plenty of, as she said, plenty of nice rooms that they can go to. But once again, the husband's very much like, you're starting to sound mad. It's just a room. And she once again comes up to the fact that if she questions it, she's going to sound even worse, even more mad than she feels she is. So she can't question this authority. Otherwise, she's going to be looked down on by these men in her life. She starts to become angry with a certain spot on the wallpaper, which she believes is a pattern that looks like a broken neck with two bulbous eyes staring at her, which is a fascinating image to behold. I mean, we've probably all seen these really old types of wallpapers with ugly patterns on, and you follow the pattern yourself and you can kind of make different images from these patterns. I think they call it pareidolia in the paranormal world, where you're making faces out of random patterns, or making things you see or you recognise out of random patterns. Further along the line, we see how the narrator actually starts to become fond of the room. And she says, in spite of the wallpaper, or perhaps because of the wallpaper. So we're starting to see this shift where this wallpaper that was once annoying her, she's now kind of growing close to it. And is that because she's got nothing else to grab hold onto in this room? She's isolated, she's got nothing else. So this is all she has to focus on. She states that she follows the pattern on this wallpaper for hours, and she doesn't know why she writes about it, but it makes her feel better. But she knows, she's self-aware that if her husband found out about it, it might not be considered normal behaviour. So she obviously keeps it from him, the fact that she's staying up for hours and hours just concentrating on this wallpaper. So before I go on, I will say there's going to be spoilers coming ahead because it's just a short story, and if I don't go into detail, then there's not going to be much to this video. So spoilers, if you don't want to know what happens, then stop watching. But as we go on, the narrator details how there's things in the wallpaper that only she knows, only she can see, no one else can. And the shapes are becoming clearer to her every day, and she wants to figure out what the secret of this wallpaper is. And she wants to figure out before anyone else. She doesn't want anyone else to figure out what's going on with this wallpaper. She then starts to believe that there's a woman creeping around the patterns, behind the patterns, and the patterns are almost becoming bars like you'd find in a prison. And funnily enough, there's bars on the windows of this room. So we're now starting to kind of look at whether the writer is using this analogy to portray her own existence. You know, there's this woman creeping around behind the wallpaper, behind the bars of the patterns, like she is creeping around the room behind the bars of the windows. We see the character or the narrator going sort of between knowing what she's feeling may not be perceived as normal and delirium. She questions her husband again about leaving the house, leaving the room, but she's told that she's getting better. But interestingly, she responds with better in body, maybe, perhaps, but, and then she stops there, and we kind of imagine that the next sentence is going to be not in mind, and her husband chastises her there, not physically, but says, you need to stop that, because that sort of talk is dangerous for someone creative like you. It's starting to talk about mental illness. We don't want to go down that road. And because once again, these men who have authority over her, she stops and she's like, okay, well, I'm not going to go any further with that, because, you know, who knows what else you'll do to me. She then starts to question whether the other people in the house, so her husband and her sister-in-law, are being affected by the wallpaper. She says that her husband is acting queer, strange, and she catches him looking at the wallpaper, and she even catches her sister-in-law touching the wallpaper. And when she questions her, apparently she's very abrupt and is like, oh, why are you scaring me like that? What are you talking about? Here we see that the narrator doesn't want anyone else, as I said, to find out the secrets of the wallpaper, only her. So she wants to dissuade these people, her husband, her sister-in-law, from getting too close to it, because she is the one who needs to find out what's going on with this wallpaper. As we go further into psychosis, we see how she's actually saying how life is more exciting now that she's spending time with the wallpaper. But once again, aware that this isn't quite normal, she knows she can't tell her husband about this. So she's got an awareness of how crazy it might sound to other people. But she just doesn't want to leave until she's figured out the story of this woman behind the wallpaper. She goes on to say the woman behind the wallpaper is starting to shake the patterns in the paper, and she's creeping all around the wallpaper and, yeah, going around shaking these patterns. And this once again makes me think of, is this the narrator kind of describing her own existence in the room, going around shaking the bars, wanting to escape, wanting to get out? The narrator then goes further into delirium, believing the woman escapes the wallpaper every day, and she sees her creeping outside, but only during the day. She sees her creeping along outside, up the roads, hiding though when anyone comes into sight. On her last day in the house, she locks the door from the inside and chucks the key out the window and then starts to tear down the wallpaper. She needs to find out what the secret is of this wallpaper. She's peeling it off all over, and at one point she tries to move the bed to get up high to rip it down, but the bed won't move. She feels it's like nailed to the floor, so she even takes a bite out of the bed, which hurts her teeth. This is really sort of psychotic behaviour that we're seeing here. As she's tearing down at this wallpaper, the faces behind the paper are shrieking at her as she's doing it. It's such an interesting way of describing this psychosis, how these shapes, this woman that she's seeing in the wallpaper is now screaming at her as she's tearing the wallpaper down. The narrator then starts to see many women in the wallpaper, not just the one, but many creeping around. And then, quite scarily, the narrator asks, she wonders if all these women came out of the paper like she did. So now this is the first point we're seeing that the narrator believes that actually the woman she was seeing, this is her. And this is the first correlation we have, direct correlation between the narrator and the woman she's seeing. Like, you get the impression that she's kind of making this analogy to a woman in the paper to herself. So the woman behind the bars in the paper is her in the room behind the bars of the window. This is the first direct correlation we have. These women, did they come out the paper like I did? Spooky and creepy and really interesting. So we see the woman, the narrator, becoming the woman. She's creeping around the room now. So the husband comes back and he's asking, like, what the hell are you doing? He wants to get in. Obviously the key's been thrown outside. Eventually he listens to her when she calmly says the key's downstairs outside. When he gets into the room, he's like, what the hell are you doing? And she doesn't speak to him at first. She just continually silently creeps around him. And then she says, I got out at last and pulled it all off, so you can't put me back in. And here the husband faints and the story ends, and the narrator just carries on creeping around the room. And it's a fascinating descent into madness for the narrator here. So overall, it feels like a voice that needs to be heard, that needs to be listened to, acknowledged. You know, it's been locked up, isolated, and ignored for too long. It's not necessarily a cry for help, it's just a cry to be acknowledged. And this is, I suppose you can correspond this with what women at the time were feeling. You know, they were just housewives. They weren't supposed to speak up on economic, social matters. And this is another, you know, voice that just longing to be listened to and acknowledged. So the imagery of the woman locked behind bars in the paper is very much mimicking her own life, stuck in this room behind the bars. She imagines her own release through the woman escaping the paper and creeping around. We witness how this isolation, or the effect of the isolation, is, you know, drawing her deeper and deeper into this hallucination, this psychosis. So the writing is very crisp and simply descriptive, very accessible. And as I was reading, I started to feel myself a sense of melancholy as I was going through the pages, and yeah, my mood descending page after page, kind of encapsulating how the narrator felt as time went on. So Yellow Wallpaper seems to me, it's one woman's struggle with her mental health, but also about women in general who just long to be acknowledged. And we see the suffocation of patriarchy with the narrator pulling her deeper and deeper into the depths of madness. It's a really interesting short story. It's only 20 odd pages long, but yeah, I found it really fascinating to kind of analyse as I went along. I probably rambled quite a lot about such a short story. I've written notes for the first time in ages. I don't tend to write extensive notes, but I really enjoyed it. I probably won't do that with longer novels because I'd be here for hours talking about books, and no one wants to hear me go on for hours. But that's my thoughts on the Yellow Wallpaper. So as I mentioned, the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction longlist has been released this morning, a day earlier than I thought it was going to be. We have The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry, The Catchers by Zan Brooks, Mother Naked by Glenn James Brown, Clear by Caris Davies, The Mare by Angarad Hampshire, The Book of Days by Francesca Kay, The First Friend by Malcolm Knox, Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon, which is one I've seen a couple of people talk about, A Sign of Her Own by Sarah Marsh, The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller, Munich's by David Peace, and A Safe Keep by Jelle van der Wooden, or Wooden. So I've ordered 3 of these so far to get me going. Glorious Exploits being one of them, because I have seen a few people talk about that. But they've announced that the shortlist is going to be announced mid-April. I'm sure last year it was the 1st of May, so that literally only gives me 2 months to read 12 books. I'm not sure if it's going to happen. I'm going to try my best, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the Yellow Wallpaper. Thanks for watching. Until next time, bye.